Hello, welcome to another interesting class in Literature in English. My name is Precious Balogun. Our theme for today is General Introduction to Prose, and our topic is style. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to define style and discuss the narrative techniques used by writers in narratives. Words are unique to different writers. Their choice of words, sentence structures, figurative language, and sentence arrangement all work together to create mood and meaning. It sets apart one writer from another. As I said earlier, words are unique to writers. Three authors can decide to say a particular thing differently. They would use different words, that's their choice of words. They will also structure their sentence differently, but they all mean the same thing. Now let's take a look at this example. Author 1 said, "She picked a red rose from the ground." The second author said, "Scarlet was the rose that she plucked from the earth." And finally, the third author said, "From the ground she delicately plucked the ruby rose, cradling it in her hands as if it were a priceless jewel." These three authors are saying the same thing. They all mean that a rose was picked from the ground. But we see that from the first author to the second author and the third author, they use different words. But take note that the different authors used keywords like she and rose. Those words were important to pass on the information. This means that writers have different styles. Now let's take a look at what style means. Style is how a writer says or presents his or her work. It can also be the manner of expression. Writers express themselves differently. It is a writer's use of language to convey an idea or thought, and it suggests the attitude of the writer towards a plot. To know a writer's style, we must examine their choice of words and the sentence structure. Now let's see narrative techniques used by writers. Narrative techniques are methods used by writers to aid their writing. Now let's take a look at the types of narrative techniques. We have plot, narrative perspective, and finally, figurative language. For this class, we'll take a look at plot and narrative perspective. Now let's see what plot is. Plot is the organization of a storyline in a sequential manner. It refers to the events that make up a story or the main parts of a story. The structure of a novel depends on the organization of the storyline, which includes the setting and the characters. In telling a story, an author starts with the introduction and expository, telling us what he intends us to know as the story progresses. Now, as the story progresses, we have the rising actions, things that occur during the story. And from that, we get to the climax, which is the peak of the storyline. That's when we become very anxious. We want to know what is going to happen next. Before you know it, the author gradually resolves the conflict, and the story ends either happily or on a sad note. Now let's see the narrative perspective authors use. Narrative technique is the angle that the writer tells his story. It is the point of view of the writer. The writer can tell from the first person point of view, can tell from the second person point of view, and can also tell from the third person point of view. Now let's see what the first person point of view is. The first person narrative perspective is when the writer uses a character that has a first-hand experience of the events in a storyline. The author can also assume this position. He uses words like I, me, and we. For example, I know my friend Ngozi is intelligent. Another example, we were to leave the village last week, but Amadi left without me. Finally, I cannot but conclude that the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of the little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Gulliver's Travels. by Jonathan Smith. From the examples, we notice that the author uses words or pronouns like I and we. Now let's see the second person narrative perspective. The second person narrative perspective is when the author behaves like an observer. He narrates the story like he's just observing what is happening. Now let's see the following examples. Management is very happy with the progress you all are making. And finally, you have to fight for your freedom. From the examples, we see that the author is just an observer. He's not part of what is happening, but he has an idea of what is happening, so he tells us what is happening. Now let's see what the third person perspective is. The third person narrative perspective is when the writer assumes to know everything. He's also known as the omniscient. He knows everything, he knows all, he knows the characters, he knows their thoughts, he knows their feelings, he knows what they are supposed to say, what not to say, and how to say it. And he uses words like she, he, they. Now let's see some examples. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. John Orwell, 1984. Finally, another example. The American and the girl with him sat at the table in the shade outside the building. It was very hot and the express from Barcelona would come in 40 minutes. It stopped at this junction for 2 minutes and went to Madrid. Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. From these examples, we see that the author knows everything because he gives us the description of what went down in each event. Now we've come to the end of the class, but before we go, let's take a quick summary of what we have learned so far. We have learned our own manner of expression. We've also learned that narrative techniques provide deeper meaning for the reader, and it also helps the reader use his imagination to visualize this situation. Finally, we've learned that the main narrative techniques used by writers are plot, narrative perspective, and figurative language. Before we go, let's test ourselves on the following questions. Question 1. Dash is the manner of expression of a writer. A. Style. B. Climax. C. Plot. D. Figure of speech. The correct option is A. Style. We said style is a manner of expression of a writer. Question 2. Which of the following is not a narrative technique? A. Figurative language. B. Setting. C. Narrative perspective. D. Plot. The correct answer is B. Setting. Setting is not a narrative technique. Now we've come to the end of today's class. I believe by now you know what style is. You know the narrative techniques, which include plot, narrative perspective, and figurative language. Thank you. Bye.